Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Danielle Perry. I'm the director of the Freeflowing Rivers Lab at Northern Arizona University and co-chair of the Durable River Protection Coalition, along with Amy Newsick, who is running the session behind the scenes today. I want to thank Amy and also Emily Height for taking care of the technical aspects of this session. In December of 2019, many of us recognize that there are very few rivers in the world that enjoy protections, that freshwater biodiversity losses continue to outpace those of terrestrial and marine species, and that billions of people are dependent on river systems, are facing increasing demands and threats by climate change. So this community of practice comprised of conservation practitioners, advocates, researchers, and legal experts came together in an aim to expand durable freshwater protections around the world. So today, our session revolves around 3 calls to action. Number 1, to halt freshwater biodiversity loss and enhance the resilience of freshwater ecosystems in a changing climate. Number 2, to recognize that freshwater is as important as land and marine ecosystems and global policy commitments such as the Global Convention on Biodiversity, CBD, and the Sustainable Development Goals. Number 3, to durably protect, restore, and sustainably manage freshwater ecosystems in an equitable and just manner. Next. Today, we will be offering simultaneous Spanish translation. So if you would like to take advantage of this opportunity, you can download the Interaction app and please mute the sound on your computer so that it functions properly. Next. Today, we'll hear from 4 researchers who will provide case study examples of durable river protections from papers they contributed to the special issue produced earlier this year. Michelle Team, Dr. Jonathan Higgins, Claudio Lagun, and Sergio Salinas Rodriguez. Then we will hear from 3 expert panelists who will extrapolate from these case studies to expand on key concerns and opportunities related to freshwater protections. We will hear from Brian Richter, Valerie Hickey, and Jirka Tainlander. We'll then have the opportunity for you to ask questions with the speakers. Feel free to type your questions in the chat box as they occur to you during the session. And if you have a preference, you can also include the name of the person who you'd prefer to answer the question. We'll come back to them in the Q&A portion of the session to have speakers or panelists answer them. So with that, we now turn to Michelle Team.
Thanks so much, Danielle. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you this morning. And I'm going to be presenting on the dilemma of protecting rivers and setting the scene really for the rest of the presentations in the session, where we will hear of both how to protect rivers in a durable way and some concrete examples of where this is already happening. When most people think of rivers, they think of just a resource to be tapped, or perhaps just blue lines on a map as pictured here. But we know that rivers are full of life, and that life really depends on the health of those river systems, and that life is in trouble. As Danielle just mentioned, freshwater species populations are declining much faster than marine or terrestrial, as evidenced by WWF's Living Planet Index. They've declined on average 84% since 1970. But when you neglect a river, it's not just the species that suffer. There are also many important values and services that healthy rivers provide to humanity, like fisheries that are critical for feeding people around the world, and the flows of sediments and deltas that flows of sediments to deltas and downstream floodplains that nourish and keep those systems healthy and above rising seas. These and many other critical functions of rivers are threatened and disappearing and declining right now. So we asked the question, what is the current status of protections for rivers globally using the latest available data? And what we found is that coverage of river length globally is just about 1% short of the 17% global 2020 target for inland waters. And that presents a fairly good picture for current extent, but we know that this is an imperfect metric because it's just looking at coverage of river length by protected area. And most rivers are actually small rivers, so that this is 70% of all rivers are less than 100 kilometers in length. So when we zoom in on large rivers, we see that global statistic drop to 14%. Even still, the global results really mask what's going on at a country or a more local level. You can see, for example, that Brazil has upwards of 30% of its rivers covered by protected areas, but that number is much lower, less than 5% for many parts of North Africa and Southeast Asia. However, it's not only the measurement of river protection that is a challenge. There are also real limitations of durably protecting rivers over the long term. And chief among this is that rivers sit at the bottom of the landscape. So they are sustained by processes that originate outside of any particular protected area's boundaries, as well as are affected by what's going on in that larger landscape, as this very simplistic image here shows quite well. Another type of limitation is that rivers often serve as the borders of protected areas. We did a recent analysis looking at this in Brazil and found that nearly half of all protected areas have rivers as a boundary, about 45%, really limiting the ability of those protected areas to offer real protections to those particular rivers that are borders. And a final example of limitations is that protected areas themselves are not always managed or recognized as being there to protect the rivers that flow through them. This is really demonstrated by a recent study that we did that found the number of existing dams within protected areas, as well as surprisingly over 500 dams planned globally to be built in protected areas. So despite these limitations, rivers have an incredibly important role to play in ensuring a resilient future for people and nature. One example comes from the Room for the Rivers work that the government of Netherlands is doing, where they're taking dikes and moving them back from the river and reconnecting floodplains to the river, such that the floodplains can act as a buffer for floods in a changing climate. The rest of this session is really going to focus both on defining what durable protections mean for rivers, and then going through a few case studies of where these have been applied. Thank you so much. And I'm going to pass now to the next presenter, who is Jonathan Higgins from the Nature Conservancy.
Thanks, Michelle. My name is Jonathan Higgins, and I'm presenting the Durable Protection Framework, which is something that we published in the sustainability issue the other week, in January rather. And this durable freshwater protection framework looks to avoid future threats to freshwater ecosystems, and these address the issues of freshwater protection at scale, and they're durable by being in place for at least 25 years or they're renewable. The framework itself is based on defining the values that society cares about, identifying key attributes and the threats and sources to them that sustain the freshwater ecosystems, identifying potential mechanisms that directly address those threats, implement mechanisms at appropriate scales, and evaluate and adaptively manage as needed. So the first step here is to identify what stakeholders care about. That could range from fisheries to recreation to biodiversity to secure sources of drinking water, include things such as cultural and religious values and scenic values as well. Hydrologic regime, water quality, connectivity, biotic composition, and physical habitat are 5 key attributes of freshwater ecosystems that maintain their integrity and maintain the ability of these systems to support biodiversity and the services that freshwater systems provide. Hydrologic regime is often threatened by flow alterations from dams and reservoir operations and from irrigation, groundwater, and surface water pumping. Water quality is often threatened, again, by reservoirs, changes in sediment and nutrient dynamics downstream from row crop agriculture and from point and non-point sources of industrial and urban pollution. Connectivity is affected by dams, levees, and poorly designed culverts at road stream crossings. Direct impacts to biotic composition tend to occur from over-harvesting and from invasive species introductions. Physical habitat, again, is impacted from reservoirs, which turn streams into lentic systems, levees, which make dry areas out of floodplains, and direct gravel mining and dredging inside stream systems. There are a variety of different mechanisms can be used to address such threats. They include legislation, such as establishment of protection requirements, interjurisdictional protection acts, basin compacts, public policy, creating financial incentives for protection. The classic one that people tend to focus on is administrative designations that give special protection to a whole or portion of a freshwater ecosystem, such as protected area designations or other area-based protection mechanisms. Regulations focus on freshwater protection include dam development avoidance, infrastructure and water use licensing requirements, water rights allocations, riparian zoning regulations, fishing no-take zones, water quality regulations. These go beyond the designated area-based approaches that we've used. Acquisition of enforceable rights of land or water include transfer of ownership or developmental rights, conservation easements, riparian land acquisition, and purchasing of water rights. Judicial actions include the public trust doctrine, rights of nature initiatives, judicial cases brought to protect freshwater ecosystems, the rights of rivers, etc. Indigenous people and local communities can implement collective management of common pooled resources. These can include local communities, no fish take zones, cultural or religious restricted area use, etc. These tend not to be recognized as formal things. Examples of implementation includes legislative and regulatory protection of hydrologic regime for high quality rivers and streams in the state of Connecticut in the United States. Legislative, regulatory, and designation in New Zealand's water conservation orders prioritize protecting any identified outstanding feature. And community-based no-take fish reserves in Thailand's Salween River Basin are implemented to protect population recruitment and feeding areas from overharvesting. So to summarize, we want to support societal freshwater values through protecting key attributes that support them using a range of protection mechanisms that address the key ecological attributes. Single or multiple mechanisms are implemented to provide protection to address the threats to processes at scale that maintain the integrity of freshwater ecosystems. Sole focus on area-based approaches to solving process-based issues will continue to fail. And I'm going to pass it on to Claudio Baigon.
Claudio, can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
you're on.
I can see my presentation. Okay, thank you. Yes, now. Okay, good morning, everybody. My talk will deal with free-flowing fluvial corridors, presenting the Paraguay-Paraná as a study case. Okay, the corridor, Paraguay-Paraná corridor is located in South America and has more than 3,000 kilometers long. Across 5 countries, is the largest remaining free-flowing system that runs from subtropical to temperate area. Unlike the eastern sector of the La Plata Basin, mostly fragmented by dams, particularly in Brazil, the corridor does not have any in the main channel. The corridor includes a large number of still well-preserved wetlands, among which the famous Pantanal stands out. In the Paraná Delta, the wetlands define, for instance, a wide floodplain of 60 kilometers. The free connected floodplains support high habitat diversity, hydrological and geomorphological complexity, and ecological and biological gradients. So why the corridors have remained as not fragmented? Well, different causes we identified, like political and economic interest, different by countries. Sorry. Well, the corridor has some impacts and threats, like dams, waterways, industrial pollution, floodplains occupied by levees, embankments, and there are not still dams in the main channels, but more than 100 small dams are expected for the upper Pantanal in the Planalto area. And dams will contribute with only 1% of the energetic demands. You can see in this map, like more of the dams will located in the upper area and will influence the Paraguay River as well. The hydrovia represents a conflicting project that has been registered by local people and NGOs. Currently, only the lower sector can be navigated because it's the only dredged sectors. The corridor has different navigability conditions, being classic the use of barges, but not only the navigation, but only the navigation of ocean vessel is allowed in the lower sector. Fishing is one of the most relevant and appreciated ecosystem services, as it has critical social role and is based on large migratory species. Other ecosystem services are water supply, navigation, flow regulation, nutrients and organic matter, tourism, etc., etc. The service that you expect in this type of large rivers. So, what are the challenges and strategies to preserve the corridor? The corridor has a high value as being recognized as a world reference system that must be preserved. To accomplish with this goal, we need to integrate people. The problem is that there are differences in the legal frameworks and institutional organizations. The upper and the lower sectors are now at the crossroad because of impacts. And of course, long-term conservation strategy will require improvement in water governance process, improvement on social and environmental information, better understanding of the synergies between natural and anthropic process, and interdisciplinary approach. And if you want to read more about this corridor, please, you can read this article at the Sustainability Journal. And I think it's all. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Claudio, for handing over the turn. I suppose I could go directly with my presentation. Hi, everyone. Thanks to the conveners for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me to talk about what does it mean, the Mexican water reserves for the environment program and for long-term protection, for long-term freshwater protection, particularly for free-flowing rivers, and to encourage to a regional escalation. I'm sorry, my name is Sergio Salinas. Today's presentation is structured in 4 parts. First, brief context on the Water Reserves Initiative setup and strategy, the initiative performance and limitations to achieve its goals, nationwide potential benefits for protecting free-flowing rivers and more, and finally, the takeaway messages for regional escalation. Surely you have heard about the Mexican Water Reserves Program. By now, there have been like somewhere between 5 to 7 World Water Weeks with sessions where this initiative has been presented. However, first thing first, and that's what a Mexican Environmental Water Reserve means. It's an annual volume of water designated to remain in the environment for ecological protection for up to 50 years. About the reserves regulation, it is important to mention that water administration and management in Mexico is competence of federal government, and therefore there is a central authority, the National Water Commission, or CONAGUA. In the Mexican water law, the environment is recognized as a legitimate water user. Second, an environmental water reserve is determined based on environmental flow assessments, which are regulated according to a standard or norm applicable to all water bodies. To guarantee the norm's early years implementation, CONAGUA and WWF, with the support of the Natural Protected Areas Commission and funds mainly from the Inter-American Development Bank, set up a strategy which implied to conduct environmental flow assessments focused on low water stress rivers with high ecological values, and based on at least 2 methodologies from a 3 to 4 level hierarchical approach. On-site environmental flow assessments were developed by academics from local universities and supported by national and international consultants. Science-based e-flow recommendations were adopted by CONAGUA and socialized in river basin councils, where local private stakeholders had voice. Alongside, the legal file was developed and the procedure followed. Today, almost 300 reserves have been established. From those, 75% fulfill theoretical recommended volumes. Detailed information from technical studies was systematized and assessed to produce ad hoc reference values for both environmental water reserves volumes and flow variability indices throughout the country. However, the reserves were enacted at annual scale. Furthermore, although limiting water abstraction to sustainable rates it's an effective way to deal with climate uncertainty, detailed on-site e-flow research and prescriptions at monthly and daily scales are still needed for implementation. So on-site regulations are yet under development. About the potential benefits for bending the curve of freshwater biodiversity, e-flow outcomes from the current system imply 44,000 kilometers of free-flowing rivers, which drain around 1/3 of the country's river network. With the right complementary set of regulations and policies, the reserves provide the protection and on-site implementation certainty of the fourth dimension of connectivity. This means e-flow requirements for more than 90 freshwater-dependent species, 60 wetlands of international importance, 80 protected areas, and water security for more than 45 million people for up to 50 years. To conclude, please have in mind that this approach to protect and manage freshwater has taken more than 15 years since the strategy early days. Mexico is still working on landing the reserves implementation by developing a complementary set of regulations, encouraging holistic research-driven assessments and long-term monitoring, and promoting an environmental water stewardship agenda. For regional escalation, don't run before walking. Current efforts include strategic work in Bolivia, Colombia, Guatemala, Ecuador, and Peru to generate on-site science and practice. This is key for success. A final mantra: be smart and limit flow alteration by allocating preventively water from the environment. Thanks for your attention.
Excellent. Thank you so much for those most illuminating case study presentations. Before we move on to the panelists, I'd like to remind you all that you can submit your questions in the Pathable chat as we move along through the questions. We'll answer your questions during the Q&A session at the end of this next section. So we're going to turn now to our first panelist, Brian Richter of Sustainable Waters, to share his thoughts on these topics that we've covered today. Brian, thank you so much for joining us. when you're thinking about connecting with climate resilience, what kind of role do these type of strategies for river protection provide in building resilience to climate change? What are the limitations?
Yeah, well, Danielle, I think it's really important for us to start with a acknowledgement or maybe an admission that we've been working on river conservation strategies for a very, very long time. And for much of that time, only until recently did we really start to consider the appropriateness or the potency of those river conservation strategies in this era of climate change that we're now experiencing. The good news here, of course, is that many of those river protection strategies turn out to be quite well aligned with climate resiliency. So just to illustrate, let's take dams maybe to start. The efforts that we've pursued in trying to create dam prohibitions to try to maintain segments of rivers in an undammed condition turn out to be very, very important now as the climate is changing. So as the climate changes, it is already changing the hydrologic regime of many rivers around the world. And so we're seeing, higher extremes. We're seeing, higher highs, lower lows in many cases. But if we've maintained an undammed, a free-flowing condition, then the river system, or at least in a large portion of the river system, then the river system can buffer and attenuate and absorb some of those climate-induced changes. And that's a really, really important aspect of climate resiliency. Whereas if you've constrained a river, if you've changed the fundamental regimes, as Jonathan Higgins was talking about, in a river system by putting dams in places in the system, then you don't have that same resiliency. You don't have that same durability in the system, in the ecological system anymore. Another example would be all of us that have been working on watershed protection. So again, going back to the extremes, climate is making the highs high, the lows lower. But if you have a healthy watershed, good vegetation cover, healthy soils, those extremes get buffered and attenuated by the healthy watershed. And it tends to keep perhaps some of those climate-induced novel variability from really wreaking havoc on the ecological system and on a lot of the ecological services that we depend upon these river systems. I was really glad to hear Sergio talk, because I want to spend my last couple of minutes just talking about the reality that you can't have a durable river protection program if you can't maintain water flowing in the river, to state the obvious. And so Sergio's point about the water reserves in Mexico is very, very important. It's becoming a huge challenge. The river systems around the world are experiencing changes now, from 10 to 40% or more in the coming decades, out to the year 2050. That's on a near-term future horizon, right? And so that's going to make it extremely challenging to manage human uses of water, human extractions of water out of these systems, given that we're going to have so much less water to work with. And so we have to figure out ways to put those protections in place. And I think this is perhaps a good moment, a convenient moment to give a shout out to my very, very dear friend, Sandra Postel, who I think all of you know was recognized this year with the Stockholm Water Prize. And Sandra and I, almost 20 years ago, we wrote a book called Rivers for Life together. And one of the concepts, sort of a central concept that we tried to promote in the book, was this idea of sustainability boundaries for river management. The idea is that water managers need to keep in mind the water needs of the river system, of the ecological system, of the human livelihoods that are dependent upon those river ecosystems as they're going through the allocation process of trying to manage how much water people get to use versus how much water remains within the system. The idea of a sustainability boundary was very, very simple, that human uses can be allowed to increase over time, but never exceeding the volume or the changes in the variability regime that would, again, wreak havoc on the hydrologic and ecological systems. So I hope that as we go into this very difficult time and trying to deal with water management in the era of climate change, that concepts like a sustainability boundary will really be central to those negotiations. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Valerie Hickey with the World Bank, and we can enjoy her comments as well.
Thank you, Brian. And I think, your points really lead to this next question for Valerie, which is thinking about the existential importance of water. So given that the existence of so many technically feasible solutions exist that are present, let me rephrase that for you. Given the existential importance of water and the existence of so many feasible solutions that present social, environmental, and economic gains, why is finance so hard to come by? Do you have any advice to mobilize funds for these solutions?
No, thank you. And thank you, Danielle. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to be here with you. You know, when I was a kid, I used to hear the phrase, water, water everywhere, not a drop to drink. And I think we often hear it now when it comes to finance. Money, money everywhere, and not a dollar for my project. And I think for us to unlock the very, very many people who want to invest in water projects and who have money to spare to invest in water projects, we have to think differently about the three key questions that we often think about when we have a project, which is, what is my project? How much does it cost? And who's going to fund it? So when it comes to thinking about what my project is, we all make the mistake of looking just at our project footprint. And we forget that our particular projects exist within a large ecosystem of regulations, of institutions, and of public infrastructure. I mean, it was so interesting to listen to Claudio talk about the Paraguay-Paraná example. It covers 5 countries. Allocation decisions in Paraguay are going to depend on decisions made in Brazil and the other 3 countries. So we have to think about connectivity. And there's no better people than water people to understand the importance of connectivity. But for some reason, we forget about that when we're thinking about projects. And it's so important to think about that broader ecosystem of institutions, regulations, and public infrastructure when we're thinking about our projects, because that's the only way to accurately assess cost and benefit. And it should be costs and benefits that we think about, not price tag, when we're putting together a project proposal. And we have to think about cost and benefit in the 3 currencies of the 3 key sectors that have money that you're going to chase. And that comes to that third question around, who do I go to try and get financing? There's obviously 3 big places where you can get money. The first is the private sector. And by that, of course, I'm talking about everybody from private individuals to private companies to the capital markets and banks. There's domestic public resources, basically government budget. And then finally, of course, there's international public finance, places like the World Bank where I sit. Each of these 3 sectors have very different currencies in which we assess cost and benefit. But all of us make the same calculus. If the benefit is greater than the cost, this is a project we're going to invest in. Think about the private sector. They're perhaps in some ways the simplest because their currency is money. They look at cost and benefit purely in terms of financial risk and reward. They price risk. If they don't know the rules of the game, if your project comes to them and you're not able to explain to them that the regulatory environment will set your project up for success, they're going to price that risk high because there's a risk of delays, there's a risk of regulatory capture of their project. And it may mean that the risk reward scales will be such they're not going to make money. That's why the private sector usually invests in things like infrastructure, because it's an asset that can grow in value, that can produce revenue. But again, have to understand that risk reward in their currency, which is money. For the public sector, for governments, their currency, a gross oversimplification in some ways, is jobs and GDP. It's growth and jobs. Sometimes it's national security when we're talking about water, but let's stick to jobs and GDP. And they would like to do anything. They will invest in anything that will create more jobs and grow their country's economies, because that's what's going to keep them in power. And so it means for water projects, if you want government funding, you have to help them understand how it's going to contribute to jobs and GDP on the cost and benefit side, both. Because it's not just that they're worried about losing their investment, it's public resources. But they're worried that if you put in place restrictions in one part of a watershed, And you say it's going to help with tourism in that part of the watershed, but is there a cost? Because agriculture in that same part may be reduced. So understanding the broader cost benefit in their currency, which is jobs and GDP, is so important. And then finally, of course, there's international public finance. Places like the World Bank. And for us, our currency, think about it as progress against the SDGs. It's SDG 6 on water, it's SDG 14 on biodiversity and natural ecosystems. You have to show us what are the costs and benefits. Because, for example, we don't want to hear that a project is going to increase access to water under SDG 6, but at the expense of undermining ecological flows, as Brian talked about, and as everybody else is talking about. And so SDG 14 is going to lose out. So think about that, because the international public finance basically ends up financing two sorts of projects. The first are those projects that basically they're not going to produce financial returns. They're not going to help with jobs and GDP, but they're important. And so that's where grant resources are used from places like the Global Environment Facility. Most international public financing is debt financing. It's loans. Even if they're low interest, no interest loans, they're loans. And what they do is de-risk for both the public and private sector. And we do that by providing technical assistance and by providing political cover. The World Bank made me do it, which can sometimes change that calculus and attract the public and private sector financing into your project. So think differently about the three questions. Don't just think about your project footprint, think about the regulatory and institutional environment in which it exists. Don't think just about the price tag, think about your costs and benefits, and think about your costs and benefits in those three currencies so you know exactly how to talk to the investor that you're trying to attract. Back to you, Danielle.
Great, thank you so much. That was really informative. I'm going to turn it now to our last panelist, Jurger Taimlander from the Secretariat of the Convention on Wetlands. Jurger, we've heard a lot of comments on the need to protect and manage for multiple requirements or objectives. How do you see that from the perspective of the convention, and specifically the wise use of wetlands? How can wise use balance needs while ensuring the ecosystem still functions?
Yeah, thanks very much, Danielle, for the question, and thanks for the very interesting input so far to the session. And I think I'll answer that with three main elements. Perhaps one is the importance of agreement, the importance of political international agreement, which is a core element of a convention process. I'll speak about how that enables us to provide tools that are relevant to the agreements that have been made. And then, of course, the cooperation, the sharing of experiences, the identification of challenges that's enabled on that basis. So as most of you probably know very well, the Convention on Wetlands, the Ramsar Convention, it's one of the global MEAs. It's a legally binding convention. It entails at its core a recognition of that fundamental ecological functions of wetlands. It regulates the water regimes. And the wise use concept was adopted on that basis as a means to maintain those ecological functions and characters so that they can support sustainable development. In other words, it's very much like an ecosystem approach. Many are familiar with wetlands of international importance, the Ramsar sites, and I just want to emphasize that parties to the convention commit to wise use of all wetlands, and they commit to management of sites. And going back to some of the introductory remarks here, I think it's good to be reminded that area-based approaches are really important in protection, but they do need to be set within broader frameworks that go beyond conventional protected areas. Good examples were provided, for example, this issue on rivers as boundaries for protected areas and so on. And here the interplay between wise use and a site-based approach is quite important. Parties to the convention have explicitly recognized the need for planning at the river basin scale, which would involve integration of water resources management and wetland conservation. And this is very much a feature of our current strategic plan, which encompasses promotion of a number of activities in that regard. So these agreements, at the very least, they provide the foundation of taking concrete action. It also provides the foundation to design the tools that are needed by countries to meet their obligations. So through the convention process, we've generated a range of tools and handbooks on wise use, on river basin management, coastal management, guidance on national wetland inventories, how they're developed and applied in this context, and so on. There's guidelines for integrating wetland conservation and wise use into river basin management. So very, very specific guidance, which covers, for example, development and strengthening of policy and legislation for river basin management authorities, boards, commissions, and so on, for setting comprehensive national water policies that incorporate wetland management, and so on and so forth. The Scientific and Technical Review Panel of the Convention has provided policy advisories, including on implementing environmental flows with benefits for society and different wetland ecosystems within river systems, so very specific guidance in that respect. That said, wise use is not a recipe that you follow step by step. On the contrary, it is an operational concept, but on the basis of the principles and tools that exist that enable countries to apply it in different contexts with an understanding of how that context requires different responses addressing different drivers. And that really brings me to this last issue of the cooperation, which really is the basis for all agreement, for all tools, for all guidance, and so on. It takes time, but it is also the irreplaceable foundation for a durable solution. In this respect, it was great to hear Sergio speak about the Mexican example of Conagua. I think, if I'm not mistaken, that the San Pedro Mezquital River, which has the Marismas Nacionales Biosphere Reserve and the Ramsar site at its mouth, was the first environmental water reserve in Mexico, and one of those pilots that enabled development of the national standards and procedures. And that example has been very much highlighted in the Ramsar Convention, including in resolutions by the Conference of Parties. As things stand, 71% of the parties see wetlands as a natural water infrastructure integral to water resource management at the scale of river basins. So this is based on national reporting in the context of the convention. 55% of parties have adopted wetland policies or equivalent instruments that promote wise use. So there's collaboration that leads to a footprint in how countries go about their business. There's reporting that enable us to track this, and that reporting provides a basis for identifying where further intervention is needed. That reporting enables us to also track sustainable development, including against indicator 661 on wetland extent and so on. It's clear that much remains to be done. Governance is constrained by sectoral boundaries on many levels, so clearly something cut out for us. And I think here in conclusion, I wanted to come back to some of the very valid points that Valerie made a moment ago. And that is, while this is, the tedium of intergovernmental process and on establishing these agreements is crucial as a foundation to enable funding. Yes, we can still leverage it better. Any entity, countries need to leverage it better, but a bankable project depends on institutional and policy and capacity conditions, not for them to be perfect, but for them to be reliable enough and credible and predictable enough so that they can be built on. Without that, funding decisions become very difficult, but also without that, funding decisions will be less likely to lead to profit or to a net societal gain in the long term. And so I think this is how, from a convention perspective, we approach wise use and how we can provide support or enabling conditions to parties on the basis of the needs and priorities they themselves set. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jürgen. It looks like we've got quite a few questions here in the chat box. So everybody get ready. I'm going to start directing some questions to various speakers and panelists. And if you have more questions, audience, please feel free to submit those into the Pathable chat box. So our first question is to Michelle Team. The question is, were riparian buffers required by law included in your analysis? And this person is interested in on comments on this topic. And it looks like Mayra Becerra is the asker.
Great, thanks Danielle, and thanks for the question, Myra. We use the IUCN database, World Database on Protected Areas for our analysis. So some countries may include riparian buffers, but I think for the most part, the regulatory types of protections like that are not included unless they have a specific geographic mapping for the entire country. So I think the short answer to your question is mostly not included. But Danielle did do some work on this as well in her paper in the same issue. So I don't know, Danielle, if you want to add anything from your side.
No, we didn't particularly look at, well, the various protection types that exist. Some of them do include riparian buffers, like the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, can be up to a 1/4 mile on either side of a river. But that isn't the case with all protection types. Some protection types include an entire watershed. So it really depends on the type of policy that you're examining to understand the full extent of what types of protections it offers. Okay, so we have another question from David Hibbert Coleman, and it's about rights of rivers. And there was another question in the chat that reiterates his question. And so rights of rivers as a topic has been noticeable by its absence at the World Water Week this year. In the panelist experiences over the last year, is rights of rivers gaining traction or has it lost some impetus? It's an open question to the panel or to the speakers. I can fill in some gaps if anyone would like. Go ahead, Brian.
Well, Danielle, I just wanted to, the observation, just casual anecdotal, is that you see more and more of those kinds of designations coming into the news, month after month. One reflection on that is that when we think about durability, true durability, we really need to think about the level of protection that those designations are offering. It seems clear that it creates the opportunity for us to defend a river in courts, for example. But there was a case, and I apologize, I don't know exactly which river it was here in the United States, but it was a place that, Danielle, you may know, but it was a place where it had been designated as having rights for the river, and yet those rights did not include water rights. And so it was a case in which the river, to my point during my comments, the river was being depleted of its waters, even though it had been recognized as having rights of nature. So we have to be very thoughtful about, as any of us might pursue that kind of protection for rivers, exactly what kind of protection does it infer?
That's a really good point, Brian. And rights of rivers in the global analysis that we did of durable protections that of various sorts at the national level, we are seeing an increasing trend in rights of rivers being applied around the world much faster than any other kind of protection policy. And we're really seeing those policies being applied in countries or states that have large indigenous populations because it tends to trend with their worldviews about the environment. However, you make a really great point about the fact that you can implement a conservation policy or protection policy such as rights of rivers, but you also have to understand the other types of laws that exist related to water resources. And in the case of the United States, in Western water law, we have prior appropriation water law, where there are senior water rights and water has to be allocated through a right. And so that is the challenge in implementing that type of policy here. And it's unique to every country in where these policies are being adopted, but we are seeing it grow rapidly. And so there's a lot of promise, and it will play out differently as people do bring cases to the courts. So stand by to see how that advances in the near future. We have another question here. It's to Claudio. How are fishermen involved in the project? What strategies are being used to address the challenges that you mentioned at the end of your presentation? And thank you in advance.
Well, the involvement of fishermen depends of the part of the corridor we are talking. For instance, in the lower sector, in the Paraná River, in the Delta area, the main problem for fishermen is now the hydrovia project, because they need to share the fluvial space with very big vessels. However, in the upper part of the corridor, in the Pantanal, the problem for fishermen is not only the hydrovia, it's also the dams, the large number of dams that are planned for the basin. And how the fishermen are involved, well, they are very weak. They are not a very strong sector. They need to be helped by NGOs or perhaps the academia. So it's very difficult to involve the people, because usually the problem is that they don't have the big picture in mind. When I talk with fishermen, I work on artisanal small-scale fisheries in the La Plata Basin. I say to them, the main problem here, guys, is not the nets, the fish sizes, the regulations. There are problems, of course, but the main problem is the water. If you don't have the water in quality and quantity, all the fisheries will have problems. So it's important to transmit the big picture to the people. The fishermen, people that make tourism, and so on and so on.
Okay, so I wonder, they're not organized in, say, a fishers cooperative or a union? Is there potential for that?
Yeah, yes, we are trying from Wetlands International, for instance, to develop cooperative, but it's still difficult because there is not a big support from the government. So, and believe me that for fishermen, it's not so easy to build and to maintain a cooperative. Perhaps they can build, but once they have the cooperative, it's difficult to preserve, to maintain, because you require to accomplish with some legal steps and so on to maintain functioning the cooperative. So, but it's a way to enhance the social capital, I believe.
Well, thank you for sharing. This next question is directed at Sergio. Were the benefits that were presented as the emphasis for these projects realized, or what was listed? What were the expected benefits?
Okay, yeah. First of all, I need to say that, yes, I have to admit that such numbers could appear to be impressive, and that's right. And I need to start by saying that just remember that Mexico is one mega diverse country. So that's one really important point, because, okay, such numbers are all trackable. They were used one way or another as input in environmental flow assessments. So one way or another, such numbers are related with the environmental flow components coming out from such assessments. So what I'm trying to say is that such numbers are actually, in this moment, the baseline, like the key targets to assess on-site implementation. And I mean on the long term of the water reserves. they are potential, they are actually potential benefits for up to 50 years. But of course, we need to monitor, we need to conduct on the ground assessments, on-site assessments to actually assess if the water reserves have been succeeding or not. There is another thing, that such baseline is that the baseline. Those numbers correspond to the reserves that were established somewhere between 2014 and 2018. Yeah. But I need to tell that there are more coming. This government has committed to establish around 150 more environmental water reserves. The problem is that half of the administration has gone, I mean, in time. and really low investments have been put in place to monitor and to conduct further environmental flow studies. So despite we have been submitting projects to conduct these assessments, we are running out of time for this administration particularly. So yeah.
Thank you, Sergio. We have 4 minutes left and 2 questions. So this next question is for Jonathan Higgins. How can freshwater durable protection have better integration with CBD and more clear goals for countries in terms of achieving protection goals? For example, the 30% goal.
That's a great question. I mean, area-based designations is part of the toolbox of protection mechanisms. And that's what the CBD post 2020 to 2030 goals are all about. But as we've seen from the presentation from Michelle's team, designations and management plans within those designations by themselves aren't sufficient. So there is some language about other effective area-based conservation measures, but those are still area-based. I think we need to look at, in some of the languages there, one, we need to be explicit about freshwater and not just land area and ocean area in the CBD. Freshwater is not mentioned explicitly. And secondly, we've got to look at things that people have pointed out, such as regulations and legislation that address the processes that sustain freshwater ecosystems at scales which are well beyond protected areas. So it transcends that scale in which the CBD is focusing on for the 2030 goal for protected areas. But there are a lot of other indicators and things that are driving success towards those indicators. I'll say, Sergio's example in Mexico, that's an example that's actually legislative and regulatory driven. They are designated basins, but as he said, this is legislative and regulation that's driving those things. And we tend not to talk about those, and that is part of the toolbox of protection. So I suggest we need to change some language in the future and talk about other effective protection mechanisms, not just other effective conservation mechanisms, which include a broad array of things.
Great insight. Thank you, Jonathan. The last question we have here is, I'm getting a message that it's probably time to close our session. So I want to thank you all for joining us today. And we can pass these questions on to our speakers and panelists and maybe get personal communication back with you at a later date. Thank you for joining us today. On behalf of the Durable River Protection Coalition, if you would like to learn more about what we're doing, what our initiatives are in the world, please contact either me or Amy Nusak at TNC and check out our special issue on durable protections for free-flowing rivers at the link provided on your screen. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.